Hey there, it's October, which means we're here to talk about some new updates once again in the Adobe ecosystem, in this case Lightroom and Lightroom Classic. These are their big annual updates that go along in conjunction with their annual Adobe Max conference. This video in particular, we're going to be focusing on one of the, really what I think is the biggest new feature or most impactful new feature right now, at least for users, which is Point Color, a new way to work with and manipulate colors within your images. At first glance, it may not seem all that different from the existing hue, saturation, and luminance controls we've had in the past, but as we get into this, you'll see that it's actually far more powerful and flexible in terms of giving you control over which tones you're working with and how you're making those adjustments. Now, a few quick disclaimers before I jump into the actual tutorial itself. In a video I released a few weeks ago about getting back into the field and kind of a channel update breakdown as well, I talked about working on a new folio, Look for the Light Volume 2, and I'm very excited to announce that I am now accepting pre-orders on that new folio. I'll link it down below. It includes 10 new fine art prints. They're all produced on the same fine art paper that I use for my individual standalone prints or my larger prints. They come presented in a soft touch paper folio and use the same pigment inks as well. So you get the same archival or museum quality prints that you would get purchasing any other prints from me. Now through November 15th, if you pre-order volume 2 of the folio, you actually will receive a bonus print, an 11th print for no additional cost. There's 4 different images you can choose from for that bonus print. And I'm also running a bundle special for both folios, volume 1 and volume 2. If you purchase both of them at the same time, you'll automatically receive 20% off of both folios. So it's a great way to get up to 21 fine art prints of mine, 8x10 size, for really by far the most valuable price point that you can get them at. And then I'll just wrap up with the usual YouTube disclaimer. If you do like this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel if you're not already. And if you really find this valuable, you can hit the thanks button down below on YouTube to make a small contribution to help out the channel and help me continue to produce content like this going forward. With all that out of the way, without further ado, let's jump on into Lightroom Classic. Now, this is going to be Lightroom Classic I'm demoing. This is fully available in regular Lightroom as well as Adobe Camera Raw. Functionality should pretty much be the same, might be a few little differences in the user interface and things like that, but the general concepts all apply the same between Lightroom Classic, Lightroom Cloud or Lightroom Desktop, and Adobe Camera Raw. Okay, so first things first, let's just take a look at this kind of sample image here or color bar image here. And we're going to just start with taking a look at what's different. So first things first, in Lightroom Classic, you now have this color mixer panel, which is a combination of the old HSL adjustments. And you can choose from HSL or color just like you could before, working with the color one by one, or working with the HSL panel and then separating out hue, saturation, and luminance on their own. And then if you look at the top of this new panel, you have the point color option as well. So that's the new piece. So before, this panel was called HSL/color. Now it's color mixer. Again, you still have your mixer tools available to you, and we've got point color as the new functionality or new feature. Now let's start with mixer just to kind of explain how these two tools are different and where they really come into play. So with the mixer, I could adjust hue, saturation, or luminance for individual colors using the sliders. So if you watch the red panel on the left, obviously it's changing hue as I slide this. Obviously you can do the same thing with saturation and then luminance as well. The other thing you can do is use the target adjustment tool by clicking on this little circle here, coming out to a color within your image, and using this by dragging up or down with your mouse while you're clicked into the image. You can see it's actually adjusting both of the color tones that are applicable for the selected color. So we're adjusting both red and orange, even though to our eye that looks red, it has oranges in it as well. So we're adjusting both proportionally to one another to really adjust that accurate color tone. If I reset this and go into point color, you'll see by default, we're starting off with nothing in here. You've got used point color dropper to add samples. So I'm going to go and click on that. Now I've got this eyedropper represented on my screen. So now if I come over to this red panel in particular and click on it, you can see there's a swatch added here. So I can see what color I've selected. You can add up to 8 swatches, and it shows you where within the hue range it is, where within the saturation range it is. So hue would be left or right, saturation would be up or down, and then where in the luminance range it is as well, or the brightness of that color value. And that's the big difference between this and the old HSL tools. HSL only lets you make a selection based on the hue of a color. So it doesn't matter how bright that hue is or how saturated that hue is. If it's red, you're selecting red. If it's bright red, you're still selecting just red. If it's desaturated red, you're still only getting red. With point color, you can make selections based on not just that hue or the color, so red, but also how saturated is the red within the image, how bright or how dark is the red within the image. So if you want to make a selection and say, I only want to adjust the darkest or most saturated reds in this image and leave the other reds alone, you can now do that with point color without having to go into your masking panel and using a color range or anything like that. You can do it all within the point color tool quite easily, which is really, really powerful in terms of what it allows you to do with refined adjustments. The other great thing is the big complaint with Lightroom masking in particular is HSL has never been available in there as its own panel. There's been workarounds, which I've got a video for in terms of how to make HSL adjustments in masking. But now this point color tool is available fully in the masking tool. So you can go in and select a targeted area with a brush or a radial or a gradient, whatever you need, and make your point color adjustments to HSL through that mask you've created, which is huge, long, long overdue. I knew at some point they were going to do something about HSL and masking, and we're finally getting it here with this October 2023 update. So if we jump back over into the point color tool here, you can see we've got these two circles or selection indicators in the color swatches. And again, this is left to right, your hue, up and down, how saturated the color is. And then this right bar is the luminance of it, or the brightness or darkness of it. To make your adjustments, I can come down here and say, well, I want to shift the hue. And you can see that the circle up top in the color swatch is moving. If I double click to reset that, I can change the saturation, which isn't going to be too noticeable moving it up, but moving it down, you can see I desaturate it. Again, that circle is moving up here. If I reset that, I can come to luminance shift and I can make it brighter. And now you'll see the luminance circle is moving on the right, or I can make it darker. But we're still getting a similar effect to what we have with HSL. This is a solid color. And you'll notice actually as I change this luminance that the oranges are changing and even the purple on the far right is changing a little bit. Now again, with HSL, it is what it is. When we're working globally like this, there's nothing I can do to avoid that. But let's say here that I do really truly only want to change that red in this sample image. So I've got a couple different things I can do. If I collapse this menu down, you may not see all these options. So if you don't see hue range, saturation range, and luminance range, just click on this triangle to expand it out and you'll find some more options to help you control your selection. And that's what range is talking about. It's the range of the selection you've made with that eyedropper tool. So if I just want to really home in on the red in this image and try to eliminate it impacting the oranges or even the, I guess it's not purple, the magenta on the far right, I can do that with these different range tools. So by default, or the standard way to do it, would be to take the range slider. This works just the same basically as the range slider within masking when you do a color mask or color range mask. You're telling Lightroom how refined do you want the selection to be. Now I've got a couple things I can do here as well to help me identify whether I am making the selection I want as accurately as I want or not. I can come down here and click on Visualize Range. And when I click on that, the image shifts to black and white for everything that's not part of the range and leaves the color representation for what has been selected. So you can see that the red is basically represented by its true color, whereas the orange is much fainter because it's not all of the orange that's being impacted, it's the reds within the orange that are being impacted. And you can see there's a little bit of a selection over here on the magenta as well. So now by using this visualize range, I can move this range upwards to expand it, or I can move it to the left to try to narrow it. And we're not seeing a huge difference, but if you watch that second bar, the orange bar, we are getting more color when it's bumped up all the way to 100 versus less color in that orange bar when it's all the way down to 0 for the range. The other things you can do, let me just double click on the range slider to reset that. The other thing I can do is I can come in and say, hey Lightroom, I want to only have this hue range or saturation range or luminance range as part of the selection. So now if I start playing with this, you'll see a couple things right away too that help you refine things and prevent getting harsh edges or what have you. Now these additional ranges are very similar in how they operate to actually luminance range masking in the masking panel, in that you've got a primary selection indicated by the box, and then you've got two side tabs that you can drag in and out to basically adjust the fall off or the smoothness of the range. So instead of having a very harsh cutoff and saying, I only want this exact range, I could have it fall off a little bit towards one hue on the right or a different hue on the left. Same thing with saturation ranges or the luminance range. I can say, hey, I want this exact luminance of red, or I can have that fall off a little softer towards brighter or lighter tones of red or darker tones of red. Really, really, again, this is where you get into the just tremendous amount of refinement that you can accomplish with this new point color tool. So let's just go and play with this. So you can see I'm already hovering on this with lower fall off. If I come over here, it's my upper fall off. And you can see a representation of those color tones. So if I'm trying to eliminate the orange bar from this selection, I can see that I probably want to play with this upper fall off. So as I start pulling the fall off in, you can see a couple things. As the swatch changes to just the selected color for the range, and then the rest of it is white, essentially. Pulling this in, and you see, if you look at that second bar, the orange bar in the main image, that I am refining this selection significantly by playing with the fall off. Maybe I want the fall off to be the same, and I just want to narrow the overall range. I can then click on the right side of the box and pull it back and see what I get. But I'm still leaving a very soft or gradual fall off to this upper limit. So I still want to pull this in because that's essentially what's pulling in a little bit of those red tones from that orange bar. And we could try playing with the same thing with the saturation, see if there's any difference. Not really seeing any changes there in any of the bars. Maybe very slightly on the magenta bar. And you can see what difference it's making in the swatch up at the top of this panel as well. But I'm already essentially in a selection that's very close to fully saturated. So this fall off's not really going to make much of a difference. So we're just going to leave that be. And then similarly, we're going to see the same thing probably with the luminance. If I adjust the fall off here, it's changing my range selection, but the actual selection in the image, or the actual color in the image, really doesn't have a luminance range variance because it's a solid color. So we're not going to see much of a difference here. We'll show a demo in a moment here on an actual photo of how this would come into play when you're working on one of your actual images as opposed to the sample image. But now I've been able to refine this selection, this range selection. I could come in here conceivably and even play with the range slider a little bit more, although I think we've already pretty well got it pulled out. But if we look at that right magenta bar, I'm actually pulling more of that out as well. So let's go ahead and pull this range slider down. So now we've got this honed in on just this red bar. So again, if you recall, starting out, it was pulling in a little bit of the orange bar. It was pulling in just a little bit of the magenta bar. But these range adjustments or range controls we now have access to, we've dialed it in just to be impacting the red bar. Now, the other thing you can do to help you visualize this, I mentioned we've got visualize range ticked and turned on right now. If I turn that off and I want to see what I'm doing with a range selection or a range adjustment, I can just hold down the Alt or Option key, then make my adjustments, and it'll automatically visualize the range. As soon as I let go of the Alt or Option key, it goes back to the regular view. So instead of having to move your mouse down and actually tick that box, you can just hold down the Alt or Option key on your keyboard, make your adjustments. As soon as you let go of the mouse and the key, it pops back in. But again, we can see that we're refining that adjustment nice and easily there using the Alt or Option key. So anyways, now that I've got my adjustment made, if I come into Hue Shift, we should see that I'm only going to be impacting the red bar on the far left instead of the red and the orange and a little bit of the magenta. So let's just move this towards orange. And yes, we're not seeing any shift at all in the orange. We're not seeing a shift in the magenta. So we've made a much more refined selection than what we had by default. Again, this is not possible at all to refine this selection with HSL tools. Same thing with saturation shift. If I pull that down, I can pull the reds down in saturation and not impact the others. And last but not least, of course, we're going to see the same thing with the luminance shift, where we're impacting only that red bar like we want. The other thing you can do is come up into the actual swatches and just click and drag the little circle around, and that's going to automatically adjust the sliders for you. But now you've got a visual representation that you can look at of, okay, well, I want to move this to a pale yellow. I can kind of move it over here to a pale yellow, and then I can grab the luminance one and say, well, I want to make it darker so it's more brown. I want to make it lighter so it's more of a pale yellow instead of kind of a murky yellow, for lack of a better way to put it. And then if I'm making these adjustments by sliding these circles around, once again, we can hold the Alt or Option key, and if I hold that down, now I'm getting a much more gradual movement on the circle. So I'm moving my mouse around a lot. You can see with the pointer, I'm putting a lot of movement into the mouse, but the circle is only moving gradually. So that's letting me make a much more refined adjustment as opposed to not holding on to it. And I'm getting a one-to-one adjustment essentially as I move my mouse. Hold down Alt or Option. Again, I get a much slower movement to help me really dial this in. And it works as well on your luminance also. The other thing I can do is if I come in and I hold Shift on this color swatch, Shift is only going to let me make adjustments to the saturation level. So if I move my mouse left and right, it's still only going to allow me to make up and down adjustments, impacting that saturation. If I hold Control or Command, now I can only make left or right or hue shifts. And even though I'm moving my mouse all over the place very sloppily, it's still only adjusting that hue because I'm holding down the Control or Command key. So hopefully by this point, you've got an understanding of how all this works and why it's so much more powerful than what we've had in the past with the HSL tools. Now I want to show you how this can work in conjunction with some masking as well. So let's jump back in here. We're still going to use this bar sample, and we'll go through another example of how this can be used getting into masking. Okay, so for this demo, let me reset the image real quickly. So we're back to the point we started at. And now let's say we want to take a look at how we can really get into some refined selections or refined adjustments with this image. To do so, I'm going to play with some masking. So I'm going to go into my masking panel real quickly here. I want to do a linear gradient. I'm going to just pull up from the bottom to create a fade out. Let's just say maybe like so. And we're going to go into our color. And let's reduce the saturation on these bars so they kind of fade out from top to bottom. Just for the sake of this example, we're not going to do anything in terms of actual masking with point color, but you can see that the point color tool does exist in here. So I could use it and it would only be applied to the gradient in this case, or a radial or a brush or whatever other mask you might create. Close out of the masking and we're back in Color Mixer. So now this is where you're going to see the ability to really make a refined selection. Like I said, instead of just selecting a specific color, we're going to select a specific part of a color. So we'll use the red or orange, whatever again, but instead of selecting the entire bar, I'm going to try to dial it in. So I'm only impacting part of the bar with a specific saturation, a specific hue, and a specific luminance value. So I'm going to grab my eyedropper here again. And we're just going to come out here. Let's just do the orange this time. And we're going to click right here. And we can see with the swatch what color we've got selected. If I start making some adjustments here, you can see again, I'm impacting the red as well. But I'm also impacting, if I come down and visualize range and slide this around, you can see I'm impacting most of that bar as well from top to bottom. But maybe I really want to make the adjustment only on, again, a very specific part of the hue value or luminance value or saturation value or all three. So again, we can come in and we can play with the range. You can see that that orange selection range is narrowing down as I go to the left and broadening as I go to the right. I'm also pulling out the red from this. But let's pull out the red some more. So I'm going to come down here to my hue range and I'm going to pull out the red. So now we're not impacting the red anymore by adjusting that lower fall off value. Right now I'm impacting from a saturation standpoint just this part of the bar. So again, I could come in here, I could expand that. So I'm impacting all the way up to the top of the bar, or I could narrow that range down for saturation and say, well, I want to be very specific on this selection. So I'm also going to reduce the upper fall off. And let's come in here and let's reduce the lower fall off. And while we continue to drag this over, we can see we're really narrowing in on a narrow band of saturation range. Maybe we want to do a little fall off there, and we've got it narrowed down quite a bit. And again, we've got the luminance range we could play with as well, but there's not a whole lot going in there on this particular one because again, it's very even luminance throughout this selection. So now as I come in here and make adjustments, I'm only going to be making adjustments to the orange within that very narrow band I've selected by using these refinement ranges. If I turn off Visualize Range, you can see what I'm doing here. I could basically desaturate it. I could lighten it up. I could shift it yellow, shift it red, make it brighter, make it darker, only in that very, very specific range. Again, I use the hue range, the saturation range to narrow that range down, that selection down, as well as the range slider, the kind of general overall range slider, to pull that red piece out of it. So I'm not impacting anything but a very specific band of color that I want to actually impact. So now let's jump into an actual photo so you can see how this tool comes into play and simplifies some of the adjustments that you can make. Things that you might have been able to do in the past with combinations of color range masks and maybe an intersection of different masks. And now we can really do it mostly within just point color, even on a global standpoint without having to go into masking. So let's jump into that and take a look at it. So here I've got an image from Wyoming back in 2018. Looking at the color mixer panel, if I go into the actual mixer section, you can see I've made adjustments to the colors quite significantly using the HSL sliders. So I've made some hue adjustments. I've certainly made my share of saturation adjustments, and I've also made some luminance adjustments. So if I turn this on and off, you can see the changes that I dialed in using those different sliders. Now, one drawback of this new color mixer panel right now is as I turn the panel on and off using the eyeball, unfortunately, there's not a separate eyeball for mixer versus point color. So if I were to come in here, let's just do a real quick one. If I came in here and said, I want to shift this purple and I want to see it before and after, well, unfortunately, as I hit the eyeball, it's also undoing or temporarily hiding the HSL adjustments I made as well. So hopefully that's something in the future that they address and give us an eyeball for mixer and an eyeball for point color. Just something to be aware of. For the time being, for the sake of this example, I'm actually going to reset the mixer panel completely so that we can see just the differences I'm making with point color. So let me hold down the Alt or Option key, we'll reset point color, and we'll start over. So let's pretend that I want to make a color adjustment, but only on the darker blues in the image. The entire sky is full of blues, but I only want to adjust the darker blues. In the past, I would have done this with a luminance range in the masking tool set, and probably then intersected it with either a color range, or it might have been sufficient just to use the luminance, and I can make my adjustments in a sky mask intersected with the luminance mask and call it a day. Now with point color, I could come out here, grab my eyedropper, just click into the darker areas of the sky. If I come down to visualize range, you get a pretty good idea of what we've selected, but it's still going to be bleeding over. So again, if I make an extreme adjustment here, you can see that really the entire sky is still getting an impact, even though I really just want to impact that darker area. Speaking of what I just did there, if I made an adjustment, I can just double click on this circle and it will reset all the applicable sliders and that adjustment. So double click on the circle, you can see both hue and saturation reset. If I make an adjustment to the luminance, again, double click on the circle and I'll reset that luminance value. Just a little tip there. So right now, the selection is not doing what I want in terms of being refined enough to only impact the darker tones. Now let me jump back to the mixer real quickly, because if I do come in here, let's say I wanted to play with the luminance of those darker tones, I could use the target adjustment tool and come out here and make that adjustment. But because HSL only works with hue or the color, I have no way to prevent it from adjusting everything that's registered as blue within the image. That's why the entire sky is being adjusted. Clearing that out, let's jump back to point color and see if we can get this selection refined so that we're only going to get the darkest tones of those blues. So by saying I want to adjust the darkest tones, probably where it makes sense for me to start is with the luminance range adjustment, because I really want to pull out the lighter tones. I'm going to narrow this range down. I'm going to make this as narrow as I can. Now, I'm never going to be able to take the upper edge or upper fall off below where the selection was made with the eyedropper. You can also see we're getting kind of blocky in this selection because I have zero fall off. So to smooth that back out, I can come in here and adjust the fall off range and get a smoother selection that way. The other thing I might want to do is looking at this and knowing I selected this darker part that's being picked up as a more saturated part of the sky as well. So I might want to pull out the lower saturated areas to again narrow this down so that I'm really going to be picking those darkest tones. Again, we're getting a little blocky, so let's take our fall off and smooth out this selection a little bit. And then I don't think I need to mess with the hue too much. I think we're good there. So thinking back to what we had to start with, where almost the entire sky was selected to some level, now we're really only selected into these darkest ranges here. So now when I make my adjustment, you can see I'm only impacting those darkest areas. Now the trick here, just like the HSL panel, is I'm still impacting everything globally because I'm working globally. I'm not working in a mask. So we're seeing some of these tones in the landscape itself are turning purple. If I make a luminance adjustment, you'll see them change as well. Let's double click and reset these. Let's just worry about the sky right now. But again, you can see just using those range adjustments, how much I've been able to dial in and refine this selection. If I wanted to make sure that I'm only truly impacting the sky, of course, that's where masking comes in. So let's take a look at that next, how we can combine point color with masking to refine our selection even more and then make our adjustments from there. So I'm going to remove this point color swatch on the global adjustments. Now you can do this a couple different ways. If I didn't want to get rid of the selection I've made, I could just come in here and double click on my circles that I've adjusted and leave it be. My range is still set the way I had it. I could come back in here and make global adjustments to that color selection I made if I wanted to. Alternatively, of course, I could just reset it. So if I hold down Alt or Option, again, I can come up here, reset point color. It's going to remove my color swatch completely. So now let's come in and go to masking. Let's create a new mask. Let's do select sky. So now we can see where before on our point color, I was pulling in some of the blues that were in the landscape. Since I've done select sky, that part of the image is no longer going to be part of this. So I could come in here, go down to my point color section, grab my eyedropper, and again, say I want to do this most saturated, darkest part of the sky only. I've got my swatch selected. If I do visualize range, again, we're going to see it's not entirely there for every part of the image, but we are still pulling in some parts we don't want. And again, we can better represent that by making an extreme adjustment, although it's not as bad as it was in the global, interestingly enough. So there is a little bit of a difference here in terms of what it picked up. It could also be that I clicked on a slightly different point with the eyedropper, and that's why we're not pulling in as much of these lighter tones. But regardless, let's refine this down a little bit. Now here, our range slider is still available, but the other ones are not. So we just need to expand this down. Again, the little arrow to the right of the range slider. Now we've got our hue range, saturation range, and luminance range. So we know before by working with it that it was the lighter tones or lighter luminance that I wanted to eliminate. I'm going to hold down the Alt or Option key. I'm going to start dragging this over so I can see how well I'm dialing this in. And again, I've got blockiness there. So now I'm going to take the fall off slider, still holding down Alt or Option. And I'm going to smooth this back in by increasing that fall off range essentially. And then we'll do the same thing with saturation. I'm going to hold down Alt or Option again so I can visualize it. And we're going to pull this out from a saturation standpoint. And let's say that's about what I want. Again, I'm going to play with my fall off or my drop off to eliminate, make sure I don't have that blockiness on the edges. And now if I want to come back up here and say I want to make those darker areas even darker, I can come in and do so. Now if we hide this mask temporarily, we can see the difference we've made, and I haven't had to go in and do any complicated mask intersections or anything like that. I've been able to refine this selection strictly with using the point color tool. And of course, just like any other mask, I could come in here and say, well, it's still impacting more than I want, so let's subtract. We'll grab a brush and let's just erase it out of here so we're not making any impact here. Maybe I don't want it in here, so we can erase it out. And then if I hide the brush, you can see hopefully on the recording that it's a subtle difference, but there's a difference because I erased out of the sky mask. If we look at the sky mask, I've got the entire sky selected other than where I subtracted out the brush, but I'm still only impacting those darkest tones simply because I used point color to really refine my selection. Now let's take a look at one last global example as well. So I'm going to close masking and we're going to go back into the global point color. So let's say I wanted to make an adjustment in the landscape, but I only wanted to impact the lighter tones in the grasses, for instance. So let's grab my eyedropper. And I'm going to look for, in the zoomed in preview, a lighter tone. I can visualize my range. So we can see that we do still have some of the trees selected, even though they're darker. So that's where I'm going to have to get into my refinement and dial it in. But I really want to impact primarily these grasses through here. And again, of course, we could do this in masking to really make sure we're only getting the area we wanted, coupled with point color like I just showed with the sky. But for the sake of example of how you can do this globally and still get a lot of refinement working globally, let's just go through this really quickly. So in this case, I want to remove the trees as best as I can. So I'm going to come in here. I'm going to pull up the fall off for the darks. And I'm seeing that the trees are going more to that grayscale representation, which means they're no longer part of it. I'm going to do a little bit of fall off. And I think I want to pull out some of the highlights too, because I'm picking up some areas out there in the distance and these little patches of grass that I don't really want as part of this selection. And then we'll expand that drop off as well. So now if I turn off visualize range, again, I can come up here, click and drag my circle or use my sliders. And let's say I want to make it warmer and shift it towards orange for whatever reason. I've got that full ability, but I'm really only impacting the grasses. I'm not impacting the trees because they're a darker color value or darker range value than what the grass is. Same thing, I can darken the grass down, I can brighten it up. You can see we do have a little bit of wonkiness coming in because the selection I've made is so narrow, so maybe that's where we need to play with the drop off again and smooth those selections out just a bit. Maybe I actually want to make this a little wider in terms of the core range. And this is a more extreme adjustment than I would make, but it's for the sake of example. Now if I turn off the color mixer panel temporarily, you can see what I've been able to do, but I've been able to do it without really impacting the trees all that much. Whereas again, before with the HSL tools, if it was green and yellow, it was going to get adjusted no matter what. I had no control over it because it was based solely on green and yellow, not how saturated of green and yellow, how bright of a green and yellow. It's much more limited than this new point color tool. And there you got it. I think by this point, if you've watched all the way through, you should see how much more powerful point color is compared to those HSL tools we've had before. I've shown you how to utilize it within a mask as well to really make a very refined selection, a specific part of the image. It's kind of funny because initially when I saw point color, I was a little disappointed by it, especially with HSL truly not coming into masking. At least that was my impression at first. But obviously once I got my hands on it and I saw how much more powerful it is compared to the old HSL tools, I'm fine just having point color in masking because it basically solves the problem that we've had all these years with not having an easy, simple way to make those HSL adjustments within a mask. Now we just do it through this new, more powerful tool. So I hope you found this helpful. Again, unrelated to this, I do have my new folio that I'm taking pre-orders on. So if you want to do that, do so by November 15th, and you'll get that extra print for free. Buy both folios, you get 20% off your order. Otherwise, if you found this video helpful, please, again, give it a thumbs up. Subscribe to the channel if you're not already. If you really liked this video and you got a lot out of it, I would love it if you'd hit that thanks button and make a small contribution to make sure that I can continue to produce content like this going forward. Otherwise, until next time, take care.